conference at the University of Victoria about technology in the future, or something like that. And I thought he was quite insane. There was a guy from, it wasn't IBM, but some major computer firm saying that within a few years, we would be able to sit home and shop from our screens, and that was the purpose of this technology, and it would make our life wonderful. I thought he was crazy. Boy, I was crazier than he was. It all came true. Everything he said came true. Is this a better world? I tend to doubt it. Anybody else? Yeah.
Toffler, the third wave, he talks in '72, he was talking about institutions changing and going through systems. I mean, you don't see this as maybe like the second wave. I mean, the industrial third. Thank you. It's beginning to crumble, and with things start getting made anew. Mm-hmm. I realize that's probably an optimistic view.
Yeah, and I have to tell you that I just think that Toffler is a very superficial thinker. I mean, it basically is sort of like just skimming the surface of historical impressions and then saying things like, well, what we need to get out of where we're at is just more industrialization in a different way. I think that's very unlikely myself. I mean, the trend, I mean, he wouldn't pay any attention to trends like falling rates of literacy, widening gap between rich and poor. I don't know who he's talking to, but it's a kind of whiz-bang, new age, technological, Peter Drucker sort of group, that thinks that, you just need a kind of commercial, administrative, industrial, whatever it is, revolution, and we're all going to be happy campers. I think it's unlikely, yes.
You kind of compared the Pax Americana to Pax Romana.
Uh-huh.
One thing that happened with the decline of Roman civilization was it had ramifications outside of its own borders.
Right.
Are you looking at the American situation or decline of American society and culture within just the borders of the United States, or do you think that there is also some emerging entity that may be able to pick up where left off?
Yeah, good question. Really good question. The last chapter of the book deals with alternative possibilities in terms of sociopolitical configurations that might, in fact, be what emerge in the 22nd century. I do take that on. My own model for that is the World Systems Theory School, Immanuel Wallerstein, for example, about, major systemic changes that happen in civilization. And I would recommend to this audience his slender book called Utopistics, which is a really good study of possible social formations in future time. So I do talk about those types of things, but obviously there are going to be enormous ramifications of this because we're in this, any fluctuation that happens on the NYSE is felt in the Nikkei the next day. I mean, we're tied into. One of the things about Rome is that you could collapse and it didn't make a difference on the other side of the globe. We don't have that situation anymore. It's highly interconnected. And so, I mean, in terms of future guesses, one might say the most likely candidate to fill the power vacuum would probably be China. That's what I would guess. But I'm not going to be around anyway. I'm just going to be sitting in bars with a fedora making jokes. Yes?
I'm having a little trouble really understanding where you're going since I haven't read your book. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by American culture? What is it that we're going to be losing here?
Well, there is this was founded in the 18th century on certain principles. It has had a tradition of certain writers and thinkers. It's followed, certain ideals that I think are largely derived from the Enlightenment tradition of Europe. And it has been a very coherent sort of thing, and one that people could identify with. There are lots of, you read standard American history books, and there are chapters about melting pot immigration and all that. My parents were part of that, coming over at Ellis Island in 1920, all that sort of thing. What we have now is the sense that there is no center. What we have now is a sense of drifting. Don DeLillo has made it the focus of his novels, the unstated premise that at some point around John Kennedy's assassination, we lost our moorings. We don't have a sense of direction now. There doesn't seem to be a sense of purpose. What has filled the vacuum, that would be a spiritual vacuum, I think, and what's filled it is a kind of corporate consumerism. That's what people are largely involved with. That's what the United States largely does. It makes money based on creating objects, creating need for those objects through advertising, and then selling them. And that's what it largely does. Up to now, one could say that, you know, much of what America stood for were a tradition of democracy, a tradition of technological innovation and entrepreneurship. All that's, you know, fine. I mean, but it has come along in a certain, there are dark sides to those developments as well. And in one of the chapters I write, called The Dialectic of Enlightenment, what I argue is, pushed far enough, things turn into their opposites. There is a dark side of democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about it. We've got it now. There is a dark side to technological innovation. Alvin Toffler would be an excellent example of that. So we have gone, we have peaked, and there's an unraveling process now that's happening. Anybody else? Yeah.
I keep wondering, where is the refutation of Malthusian theory? You know, is there any reason to be optimistic in the very least if population increases and, you know, the gulf between rich and poor, which is in the book, you didn't really mention, declining literacy rates, which you did. At what point, in other words, do we forget about spiritual death? What about physical death? What about pollution and overpopulation?
Yeah, those are problems, of course, that are largely beyond our borders. And as far as overpopulation goes, the United States is probably not in the worst situation, you know, as what does India have now? I mean, I don't know, but, you know, maybe 1 billion? I mean, I don't know. You know, but those are the types of things that will come home, but in a sense of shockwaves, because they're borderless problems. There's no border for pollution, you know, and so on. Still, you know, there are, you know, serious attempts to use science and technology to clean things up. It's possible, for all I know, that Lake Erie is better now than it was 30 years ago, you know, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read your book either, and I haven't thought this through, but I'm thinking there are many books now talking about how everything's speeding up, and you always see that nice graph of history. Would the monasticism have been an instance, for example, of slowing things down? Might that be a solution?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or did old cultures ever speed up because they did not have the technology we do have now? But in their own way, they speed up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, these are good questions, really. I mean, certainly the monastic situation is an enormous slowdown of time. And I think, frankly, one of the healthiest responses, I mean, I have to work so hard just to stay in place, you know. I mean, I feel this every day. And I think one of the healthiest responses one can do is to return to a space in which you're not allowing that to happen in your life. I mean, just for your own sanity. Whether that, you know, whether we can say that they were in the context of a speeded up culture then, that I tend to doubt. This strikes me as being a very modern phenomenon, really a very modern phenomenon. You know. Somebody else, yeah.
In your book, you mentioned adbusters as an example of the monastic idea. In a recent issue, they focused on the rampant prescription of drugs like Prozac. Could you comment on how that relates to your thesis?
Yeah, I mean, this is the part of the dark side of this, the hectic pace of life, and also a sense of meaninglessness, you know, that's going on. 1999, 3 billion prescriptions were filled in the United States. A large chunk of those were for Valium, Prozac, Zoloft, Wellbutrin, Paxil. I mean, psychoactive drugs that essentially cool you out, you know. Why would that be? And incidentally, that figure has been rising steadily, 5% every year. So 2000, the figure is estimated to be 5% more. 2001, 5% more of that. What does it say about a civilization that is basically a medicated society? That's only prescription drugs. Feed in illegal narcotics that flow through this country, you know, in and out of ghettos and so on and so forth. Just feed in that. Feed in just simple white-collar 3 martini lunches, rates of alcoholism. This is a sad country. I mean, basically, those kinds of data indicate to me that people have pretty unhappy inner lives, you know. I don't see that a civilization can really sustain itself without an energy that says, I do want to get up in the morning. I do want to do what I'm doing. You know, this kind of thing. I mean, I personally know of cases, for example, of people who have made the choice to stay with jobs or take jobs where they're making $80,000 to $100,000 a year and they feel they need that kind of money to survive, and to take Prozac so that they can get through the day on a daily, get through their lives on a daily basis and manage the type of workload that that involves, you know? I mean, to me, that means that's what I mean by spiritual death. Why would people be taking drugs anyway? I mean, I smoked a lot of marijuana in the 60s. You know, I inhaled, let me tell you, I inhaled a lot, you know. And yeah, it was fun. Now it's kind of boring. I mean, I'm not into it, you know. But one thing I know is that for me, it wasn't about my life felt impoverished, and so I had to keep doing it. You know, I mean, it wasn't about that. But, you know, it's a very common thing, I think, the sensation of spiritual death. And then, in a sense, you get yourself into a state where nothing really matters too much, and you're just floating through life, you know. I mean, those types of statistics of even just prescription psychoactive drug use in the United States that arise dramatically every year, to me, are killer statistics. They really say what's going on. You do not find that in major newspaper articles, you know. So, yeah, anybody? Yeah.
Do you see any hope in our multicultural society? Because the comparisons that you have used, you know, you're going on Rome and probably Greece. I haven't read your book, but you know, one of the things that come out of that is that they were very homogeneous societies. And I'm just wondering, because we have so many different pockets inside of the United States, if there can be some hope in, you know, in the division, you know, that the thought processes might not be.
Yeah, it's a good question. With regard to homogenization, let me just say one thing. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about alternative socio-political formations that could occur. And one model I talk about, and I specifically say, although I don't think it could last forever, it's, as an intermediate solution, I don't think it's the worst we could face, and that's the Hellenistic model. Roughly, I mean, the dates are roughly 331, you know, BC to about 31, something like that. But roughly, if we take the Hellenistic period from, let's say, 200 BC to 200 AD, this was not a homogeneous society in the Mediterranean basin. It was very multicultural. And it was very interesting. It was very rich, because you had to pay attention to the Roman umbrella. Everybody had to pay lip service to that. And if you challenged the authority of the state, for example, like the Jews of Palestine, the Roman machine came down in no uncertain terms. But basically, if you didn't do that and you just hid out, you know, hung out, there were all kinds of subcultures, and that may be a viable possibility. With regard to the situation in the United States, one of the problems is that, with the exception of one minority group, the other minority groups are having an awful lot of trouble financially and educationally for whatever reason. The minority group that succeeds are Asians. They do better than whites on standardized tests, especially in science. They do extremely well. Blacks and Hispanics don't do very well. Now, there are all kinds of reasons for that, but those are the data. July 4th, 1999, front page of the New York Times, there was an article of black leaders discussing the fact that regardless of socioeconomic class for African Americans, they do badly on standardized tests. And what does that mean in terms of their share of the economy and stuff like that? And, you know, I mean, all kinds of difficulties then ensue. And, you know, people like Jesse Jackson and so on were lamenting this and saying they didn't know what the answer was. They didn't know what the solution. I don't know either. But, you know, it's sort of like those types of problems strike me as real problems. I don't see in them somehow flipping over to a kind of Hellenistic model where this would enrich us. They seem to be things that we can't seem to solve, and they create the kinds of, minority rage that I certainly understand and I think is justified, but we don't seem to have a way out of it, because basically what we've learned is throwing money at the problem doesn't work either. So I don't know where we are with that. you know, yeah.
Is the United States unique, or are the other Western industrialized countries in much the same shape?